You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. Going solo today. Happy 2025. Happy New Year to all you folks out there. Our Crimson Cast listeners, whether you're a first-timer or a long-timer, we are elated to have you still with us or with us for the first time as we head into 2025. So much to talk about on the college sports scene, so much to talk about with IU football, with IU basketball, and wanted to get the year started off with just something to talk about all of those things. So we're actually going to do a two-part episode today. First part, I'm going to focus on the college football landscape, some of the news that we've had with IU. Scott and I will be on together a little bit later on, probably early next week, to talk through some of these things in more details. But there's a lot going on right now, both in terms of the college football playoff and in terms of IU that I wanted to tackle, just because I think that we still need to have some conversations about everything that happened this year and a lot that's happened in the playoff and the bowl season that has cast the events of this year into a little bit of a different light than they were before. So first part of this podcast is going to focus on that. Second part, I'm going to talk some IU men's basketball. Big win yesterday for Indiana as they hosted Rutgers. We're going to talk about that game and talk about kind of where things stand right now. Did that game make a big difference for IU in terms of the big picture? Or was it just another example of a game that maybe doesn't have a great level of representation as far as where Indiana's going? We'll talk about that. First of all, just a couple of sponsor reminders. First of all, we are brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Home Field Apparel, your place to go for all of your college sports needs, and they have been cranking out new materials. They had that amazing college football playoff array, including some IU stuff, which I was able to pick up. Several of my friends were able to as well. Some great college basketball stuff. They just released a kind of a curated Big East collection, some cool stuff in there. Xavier apparel, some UConn apparel, some DePaul apparel, just a lot of great stuff. And you'll find so many things, not just IU related, but across the spectrum of college sports at homefieldapparel.com. Go over, check them out, homefieldapparel.com. Check them out on social media. They're great on Instagram and X and other venues as well. Use the code HOME23. Again, HOME23. Get 15% off your first order. Again, that's Home Field Apparel, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. Speaking of the Back Home Network, be sure that you are subscribed to the Back Home Network's YouTube channel. We've really made a concerted effort to get more and more of our shows on video as well as audio. We're never going to abandon audio. We're going to always have an audio feed, but many of you prefer to watch the podcasts, which has been a fascinating turn, I got to say, and it's been really gratifying meeting so many people who now know what I look like. I ran into a bunch of people yesterday at the upstairs pub. I was watching the Georgia Notre Dame football game, and a bunch of you came up and said hi. It was great to meet everybody that was there. And, that's kind of the power of video, I guess. And so we'd love to have you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Just search Back Home Network on YouTube. We've got nearly 7,000 subscribers, and we've got a bunch of fun things planned for this upcoming year and a great array of shows. It's not just Crimson Cast. It's also some of the sub-brands on Crimson Cast. We've got Bison Chat. We've got some other shows coming up, Bloomington Food Review, which some of you noted. We didn't do that on video, but the next one we'll do on video. And then, of course, our longtime partners and friends over at the Assembly Call, they were on last night right after the Rutgers game, breaking down what happened there. They also have shows throughout the course of the week, the Doing the Work podcast covering IU women's basketball, and so many more things to watch and listen to on the Back Home Network. So subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to our individual Spotify or Apple Music feeds. We'd love to have you in the mix. And finally, just a reminder, we are on Substack here at Crimson Cast. It's crimsoncast.substack.com. It's free to sign up. You can join the over 1,100 subscribers that get podcasts delivered right to their inboxes. There's also a paid option if you'd like to help financially support the podcast, $5 a month, $50 a year. Great gift idea if you're still looking for something immediately post-Christmas or post-holidays to give. And we will be hopefully having a little bit more VIP content. We do occasionally have some subscriber-only content in the mix once every couple of weeks if as we've tried to move forward with this, just to give you folks a little bit of something extra. We appreciate the support. So again, Crimson Cast available on Substack. We'd love to have you part of the community. All right, let's go ahead and launch in to talking about the college football landscape. And man, there's been a lot of stuff to cover over the course of these last few weeks. Of course, Indiana had their season come to what felt like a premature end in some ways, but in other ways, it was just a ride I think nobody wanted to stop. But they lose at Notre Dame 27-17 a couple of weekends ago. And coming out of that game, and really during that game, one of the things that was a prevailing expressed opinion, primarily by ESPN, but others as well, certainly are, Mr. Ryan Russillo over at The Ringer and Todd McShay, Colin Cowherd. We heard several media personalities, and some that I won't even bother to mention that are on social media, loudly proclaiming that the result of that game, which again I'll note was a 10-point loss on the road to a Notre Dame team that was demonstrably one of the 4 or 5 best teams in college football this year, that somehow indicated that Indiana should have never been invited to the college football playoff in the first place, that the college football playoff was fraudulent in some way for having Indiana in it. Sean McDonough, the play-by-play broadcaster, decided to go out of his way on the broadcast during the game to crap all over Indiana and talk about how this was just a non-competitive game and essentially implying it was a waste of everybody's time. Kirk Herbstreit, who, for whatever reason, over the last couple of years has decided to take his status as the darling of college football coverage and become the villain, decided to loudly proclaim, both on the post game of the Indiana Notre Dame game and the coverage the following day for the rest of the playoff games, that he stood on the sidelines and Indiana just didn't belong there. They clearly didn't belong in the game. What's been fascinating since then is that the almost every other playoff game has been decided by a wider margin than that Indiana game. And as we saw last night, with Notre Dame soundly defeating Georgia in the Sugar Bowl, and I'll note scoring fewer points than Indiana did against that Notre Dame defense, who was missing one of their best players who got injured during the Indiana game. If you're an Indiana fan, you're sitting there and you're just kind of shaking your head saying, yep, see, everybody was wrong. The Hoosiers definitely belong. The Hoosiers played certainly not their best game and certainly not a game that I think the fans like myself that went up there were hoping that we'd see Indiana play. But two things. A, Indiana acquitted itself just fine in the big scheme of things. And B, nothing about that game indicated Indiana didn't belong in the playoff. If it did, then we've got a really significant problem with the way that college football is being talked about. And that's really what I wanted to dive into, which is the way that all of this has been handled by ESPN in particular, but also other entities. I mean, I don't want to just single out ESPN because I think, again, The Ringer falls into this category. I think there's some personalities that we've seen with some of the other outlets. They've really taken what I consider to be the wrong approach and a very weird approach when it comes to covering the college football playoffs. Zach Osterman from the Indy Star had a really good piece about this a couple of weeks ago in the immediate aftermath of that Indiana game. And, really it was a puzzlement about why ESPN had decided to essentially crap all over the thing that they've spent so much money essentially trying to prop up and change and mold into what they would like to see, which is the college football playoff. And, when you look around media coverage, I think one of the big things that is really worth noting is when the NFL playoffs happen, and yes, I know the NFL is professional, but as you've heard me talk about on this podcast before, college sports is basically professional as well. When the NBA playoffs happen, when the NFL playoffs happen, when the college basketball tournament happens, rarely do you see a situation where the network or networks covering the event spend any amount of time talking about how this team or that team doesn't belong. You'll occasionally get it at the very beginning of the college basketball tournament draw when they'll be surprised when one at-large team makes it in over another. But that generally is confined to, that show. People will say their piece. I didn't think Providence deserved to get in over this team. This team had much better wins. And then it goes away. And then the actual coverage of the event happens, and it's celebratory. It's, wow, here we are. It's March Madness. Let's enjoy these games. This is a special time. The NFL playoffs are upon us. We've got a few weeks of this, and we're going to determine who the best team in the NFL is. And this is going to be really fascinating. And hey, there's teams that had great regular seasons and teams that barely snuck in, but that's part of the drama and the excitement of it all, is to see, who's able to come out on top. Major League Baseball. We don't spend a lot of time bemoaning how like a wild card team doesn't belong there. And we've seen a lot of wild card teams or teams that didn't have the best record in baseball make it all the way to the World Series, sometimes win the World Series. Rarely do you hear any more than just some cursory complaints at the very beginning about like, why do we have 6 teams in the playoffs or something like that? It's rarely a consistent narrative complaining about the teams that are currently playing the games. And that's what we've seen, especially out of ESPN. And I think they deserve a significant amount of criticism for the way that they've covered this sport that they have chosen to put so many financial resources around, the sport that they have chosen to mold externally as a media entity. And I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind. ESPN has meddled in college football maybe more than any other sport has been meddled in by a media entity. The NFL is kind of a unique property in that it's always been a bit of a cabal between media executives and the owners, but it's been able to do that in a way that's been beneficial to both sides. It's probably the most positively symbiotic relationship that we have in sports media, where the networks get tons of inventory, tons of content, and the teams get tons of money, and the players get lots of exposure, and every game is national. College football has been meddled in by ESPN really for about the last 20 years. And there's like numerous instances of that. I could do a whole podcast just talking about the meddling that ESPN has done. And, a lot of it is, even something as simple as when the last big round prior to the most recent one of conference realignment was happening. And Texas and Oklahoma were getting ready to potentially move to the Pac-12 and almost did. In fact, the Pac-12 leadership, the presidents there turned them down. That worked out in the long term, didn't it? But ESPN ended up coming up with the Longhorn Network and additional money to keep Texas and Oklahoma in place in the Big 12, largely because they didn't want Fox to control directly, 2 of the 4 leagues that were going to comprise college football's power brokers. They wanted that 5th conference. Now, eventually that went away through a different device, but it went away with one of Fox's more or less controlled entities, the Pac-12 disintegrating. So ESPN kind of won that. But, you go down the pathway, and everything from the way the BCS was covered to the way the college football playoffs been covered to the selection shows that ESPN chooses to televise to the commentary immediately afterwards. Like, there's a tremendous amount of meddling that's happened in terms of how ESPN has tried to approach this. It's also worth noting that ESPN has made a huge financial investment in the SEC network. A lot of people don't realize this, but the SEC network is not set up the same way that the Big Ten network is set up. Big Ten network is majority owned by Fox, but then about 40% of it is owned directly by the teams in the Big Ten, by the schools themselves. So Indiana actually has a share of the Big Ten network that they own, along with their conference partners. SEC network is I think 80% owned by ESPN and 20% owned by Hearst Television, and then they pay out to the SEC. So it's an even more direct investment that ESPN has, and it's less of a partnership with the SEC as more as it's ESPN having a business interest in the SEC. And when you look at the coverage, when you look at the way that the college football playoff's been talked about, I think the thing that's most egregious about what ESPN has done throughout the course of this entire cycle of college football playoff coverage has been the clear agenda setting and framing that they have tried to do to position their particular property, the SEC, as being so vastly superior to the other college football playoff products that are out there, the Big Ten, the ACC, which, let's be honest, was kind of crap this year, the Big 12, trying to position the SEC at a level above the rest of them and maybe just slightly below the NFL. I think those were Lane Kiffin's own words in one of his press conferences this year. And this is where I think if you're an Indiana fan in particular, you have the right to be aggrieved. I think if you're a Big Ten fan in general, you have a right to be aggrieved. I think certainly if you're a fan of SMU, you have a right to be aggrieved, because what we've seen through the process of all of this coverage is just a straight up misrepresentation of some very straightforward things with very little explanation about how the process is supposed to work or why things might be not the way that they're being presented by ESPN. And what I mean by that is this. What we heard from about the beginning of November on, so right when the college football playoff selection process or the selection committee was starting to meet and put out their weekly rankings, what we heard time and time again were these disingenuous arguments from ESPN personalities, college football playoff reporter, commentators on their various shows, Paul Feinbaum, who they insist on putting forward as some kind of an expert on college football, that somehow the SEC should be exempt from the things that college football has always focused on as things of primary importance, which are wins. Wins and losses, whether they make sense or not, have always been a primary measure by which we've judged college football. And if you make it through a season undefeated or you make it through a season with one loss, you get rewarded for that because it's very hard to do those things. ESPN also made a decision to basically misrepresent, or at least I say ESPN made these decisions. Was there an actual network-based decision on this? I don't know. But certainly their commentators and their reporters decided to push a particular set of I wouldn't even call them facts. I would call them theories that were being presented as facts about what mattered in terms of the metricization of these various teams. And this is where I think ESPN has really done a disservice to college football in general, because it's tried to take something very complicated and present it as something very simple. And it's not very simple. A lot of the commentary about Indiana not belonging, which long preceded their loss to Notre Dame, let's get the memories straight here, was predicated on the idea that Indiana hadn't played anybody, that all they'd beaten was a bunch of weak teams, and that should be disqualifying, while these SEC teams that are playing these incredibly strong schedules should be given, extra credit, should have losses exempted. Essentially the rules of college football and the way that it's been metered out over the course of time, that those somehow shouldn't apply to SEC schools because of reasons. The reasons being, well, the eye test, which that's always, whenever somebody says the eye test, you always know they're full of crap when it comes to judging college sports teams. The strength of schedule, or, the point spread. God, Alabama would have been favored by X number of points in that game or this game, or Georgia would have been favored by that many points. And there's several reasons why that kind of rationale, being put forward by supposed experts on college football, you really have to question what the motivations are. So let's break down a few things first and foremost, and kind of set a base pattern of understanding of what we're dealing with. One of the issues that I've always had with the way that we try to think about college football is it was very hard in the pre-college football playoff era to really know who the best teams were in college football, and it's actually gotten less easy. And a lot of that is because of the bloat that you see in college football in terms of conferences. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the early 90s, in most cases, you could say definitively whatever team won a particular league was probably the best team in that league, because those leagues generally didn't have more than 10 teams in them. Some of them had fewer than that. Some of them had a couple more. But the Big Ten is a good example. Michigan or Ohio State won all those titles. Were they the best teams in the conference? Yes, they were, because with one exception generally a year, you were playing your entire conference. And you got a pretty good sense from that. You'd occasionally have a game or a season where you'd have two teams that had the same record because they hadn't played each other. But for the most part, the conference champion was a pretty good indicator. that was the best team in the or at least the luckiest team that year, the team that had the most going for them. As the Big Ten gradually expanded, went to 11 teams, then went to 12, then went to 14. Now they're at 18. Any team is only going to play at maximum like 55% of their conference in a given season now. And so this year's a great example. You look at the schedules. Indiana had to play who Indiana had to play. And if you looked at Indiana's schedule before the season started, I mean, they had to play Ohio State on the road. They had to play defending champion Michigan, defending runner-up Washington. They had a UCLA team coming in that was considered to be at least halfway decent. They were rated higher than Indiana in the league. A Nebraska team that was expected to win like 9 games. This was going to be the big comeback year for Nebraska football. And none of that really materialized. Ohio State obviously was very good. And Indiana played them better than they were given credit for in Ohio Stadium. But like Michigan, who finished the season with 8 wins, and who beat Ohio State, and who beat Alabama away from home in both cases. When Indiana beat them by 5, that was held against Indiana. Why? Well, because A, we were dealing with incomplete information. We didn't know how the full season was going to go for Michigan. But the judgment there was, well, Indiana didn't beat them by enough points at that moment in time, at the beginning of November. Therefore, they must be disqualified from the college football playoff discussion. Why? Well, that was never a really well-crafted rationale by the folks who were arguing it. But they were given a platform where they didn't have to give a rationale. They could just say things like that and not have any impact. And yeah, there would occasionally be some questioning, but never on the show, never at the location from which the criticism was coming from. So you've got this issue in college football where you've got unbalanced schedules, and it's not just the Big Ten. Think about the SEC. We talked about this before on an earlier episode. Texas didn't play Alabama. Texas didn't play, I think, South Carolina. You had several different teams in that league who didn't play each other because, again, much like the Big Ten, the SEC is too big. You can't play everybody. You're playing 50% of your schedule. It's less in the SEC because you're only playing 8 conference games, not 9 like the Big Ten does. So you have even less of a clue. And this system kind of made sense because if you think about in the 4-team playoff era, it wasn't that big of a deal if you had a team that went 11-1 or 12-0 and didn't play everybody in the league. You wanted to have as many lottery tickets, basically, to try to get a team that was undefeated or only had 1 loss into the college football playoff, and you just hoped that the chips fell the right way for you in that process. With a 12-team playoff, it's different. And I think one of the biggest and most egregious things that a lot of the football commentators did this year that really, I think, hurts the perception of the sport and certainly has created a lot of arguments where they didn't need to be, was that these people have not adapted their thought process to the system that college football has instituted, where you have 12 teams. And as you know, if you follow sports in general, not every team is going to be the best team. Not every team is going to be at the highest caliber. And the argument coming out of that first week of the college football playoff was, well, gosh, this playoff's too big, right? Like, all the teams that, 9, 10, 11, and 12, they all lost in that first weekend. Indiana lost to Notre Dame. SMU lost to Penn State, and it wasn't particularly close. Tennessee got blown out by Ohio State, far more than Indiana did against Ohio State on the same field. You saw in that process Texas and Clemson. That was a little bit of a closer game, but Texas ended up being clearly the superior team. But the same commentators who complained about the Indianas and the SMUs jumped on that immediately. And they were like, ha, see? Indiana shouldn't have been there because they lost on the road to Notre Dame, a really good team. Like, that was their argument. And people were like, well, of course they shouldn't, Indiana shouldn't have been let in. SMU loses on the road to a really good Penn State team. Everybody's like, see, SMU shouldn't have belonged. It was just vacuous, terrible analysis, but it was allowed to stand because there's this attitude that exists within college football commentary where a lot of those folks are still acting like it's a 4-team playoff or like this is somehow an imposition. And it's been funny watching them try to react to this next round where all 4 teams that had byes lost. Oregon, who everybody is just agreed was the best team in college football, got obliterated by Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, neutral site game. Georgia, who we were being told over and over again by Joe Tessitore that, win or lose in that Georgia Tech game, Georgia belonged in the playoff, despite the fact that as he was saying that, we were watching Georgia play terribly against Georgia Tech, a game they should have lost. But we were told over and over again, this Georgia team is something different. Look at the schedule they've played. Look at the wins that they've had. Even though they weren't that special, their defense, did not look that particularly good throughout the course of the season. It was very mercurial. They clearly had some talented players. They have NFL talent on that roster, but they hadn't played that particularly well as a team. But that was just brushed aside. Georgia loses to a Notre Dame team that a lot of people didn't regard particularly highly. Boise State loses. They kept it closer than I think people thought that they would. I think they deserve some credit for that. And then, of course, Arizona State ends up losing after making a big comeback and taking that game to overtime. Even that, though, was, that was a game where I think, people came into that game thinking there's no reason why Arizona State should be here in the first place. So now the argument has turned into, well, gosh, there's no reason why we need to have this many teams in the playoff because, now the new narrative is, well, the buys are bad. The buys hurt. And it's like, you guys are kind of missing the point here. The idea with the college football playoff was let's get these teams into a scenario where they're able to play each other and demonstrate on the field what's happening. I saw a bizarre argument today that the college football playoff doesn't reward the best teams in college football, just the hottest teams in college football. That was a Chip Patterson argument from CBS that because Ohio State's gotten hot, even though they certainly didn't look hot by losing to Michigan going into the college football playoff, or because Penn State got hot, despite the fact, of course, they were coming off of a loss in the Big Ten title game. That Texas got hot, despite the fact they lost in the SEC title game. I could keep going on this. That this is somehow a bad thing, that we're rewarding teams that are winning games in December and January. And this is something I think from an IU fan's perspective, this is a new sport for many IU fans. In terms of, obviously, we understand how college basketball works. And there's some IU fans that are very, very familiar with college football. But a lot of IU fans, we haven't really dipped our toe into the larger pool of college football because IU's just been in survival mode for essentially the last 120 years. It's like, hey, you get to 5 wins in a season. You're like, hey, maybe be on the fringe of a bowl. And you really don't think about how the upper levels of the mechanism works in college football. And what we found is, I guess not surprising, in as much as it's territorial and you're not going to get credit for anything, even things that you should get credit for. You might get credit from certain corners, but then other corners are going to go right at you. And I think Indiana fans have been, and I count myself in this, have been bewildered at how Indiana went from being the darling of college football for the first couple of months of the season to somehow public enemy number one in the eyes of ESPN, and that ESPN would either directly or indirectly weaponize their entire commentary class against Indiana specifically as an avatar for all that's wrong with the college football playoff selection process, when it looks like the college football playoff selection process was perfectly fine, except for some of the weird rules like, hey, we're going to give the top 4 conference champions automatic buys. That's probably something that needs to be revisited. But the selection process was fine. And the bowl season has gone a long way towards demonstrating that, no, that weak-ass Alabama team did not actually deserve to be in the playoff. They just lost to Michigan's backups because between injuries and opt-outs for the pros, Michigan lost a ton between their last regular season game and that Cheez-It Bowl game that they played. Illinois, who was disregarded entirely by the national media except for Tom Fornelli, ends up beating South Carolina, who were the darlings of a lot of people. There are people arguing that South Carolina deserved to be in the playoff instead of Alabama. South Carolina lost to Illinois. You see these things over and over again. And Joel Klatt, I think, from Fox has done a really good job of being a reasonable voice. Nicole Auerbach from NBC has done a good job of being a reasonable voice. I don't think any Indiana fan is legitimately arguing that they were one of the best 2 or 3 teams in college football. But I think all of the evidence clearly indicates that Indiana was like the 7th or 8th best team in college football, and they absolutely deserve to be in the playoff. And I've seen a lot of people complaining that IU fans are being miserable online and that they're constantly whining about the way they were treated. And my response to that is good. They should be, because they were treated terribly. And Indiana as a football program was treated terribly by a group of people who should have known better and probably did know better, but chose to take that level of argument for reasons that I think we need to continue to discuss. And one of the things I've been arguing for a while is like, this is not one of those situations where you just sit back and say, okay, we're not going to say anything. We're just going to let our deeds speak for themselves. If we've learned anything from this college football season, it's that it's probably the most political of all sports. This is where, like, the pros, to some degree, yeah, there's stuff that goes on behind the scenes, but the NFL has to be somewhat neutral in its approach in terms of like how the rules are set up. You'll get occasional things that will favor one group over another, but it tends to even out over time. College football is just one big political convention. It is our people against your people against their people. And unless you go on the offensive and consistently are out there stating your case and arguing your points and saying, no, what that group or that person is saying doesn't make a lot of sense. Unless you're out there doing that, you get buried by public perception. Like, there's a ton of people out there right now who didn't really have a strong opinion on the matter in late October who are convinced that Indiana didn't belong to be in the playoff and that SMU didn't belong in the playoff. Why? Because ESPN has said that over and over again, week after week. I think if I've got a frustration with the Big Ten, with Fox Sports and the Big Ten Network and the Big Ten Commissioner, it's that, we've seen the politicking coming from the SEC and from ESPN on behalf of the SEC and its teams. We haven't seen that same level of politicking and public proclamation and agenda setting coming from the Big Ten and from its member schools and from its networks that it's partnered with. And that's got to change, because ultimately that framing does matter and the perceptions do matter. And they matter in terms, yes, of how fans perceive you, but they matter a lot in terms of how committee members perceive you as well. And it's played out about as well as it could for the Big Ten and for Indiana in particular, given the fact that there's, the SEC has been left in ruins. They've got one team technically left in the college football playoff, a team that wouldn't be there right now if targeting had been properly called. Maybe there's a possibility Arizona State doesn't go down and win the game on a field goal, but they were in really good shape if they had gotten that penalty. But I'll also note that Texas is basically a fake SEC team. That's a Big 12 team that just changed conferences. Like, that's not really an SEC team. All the actual SEC teams are gone. Georgia, beaten by Notre Dame on a neutral site in the SEC territory in the Sugar Bowl. Tennessee, boat raced in Ohio Stadium. Nobody else made it. And it's kind of funny to me that their hopes are now relying on Texas. I think Texas will be an interesting opponent for Ohio State. I don't think it's going to be necessarily a walkover. And the fact that it's in the Cotton Bowl, again, gives a little bit of a benefit, I think, to Texas. But I think Ohio State's going to be the betting favorite in that game because I think they are the superior team. So all of the sequence of events, the bowls, the playoff outcomes and things like that, you couldn't have asked for a better set of scenarios, both to vindicate Indiana as a program this year and what they did, but also to vindicate the Big Ten and the fact that you've got, two of the four remaining playoff teams are Big Ten teams. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Ohio State and Penn State playing for the national title. I think that they're, Penn State and Notre Dame to me is kind of a toss-up in a lot of ways. I'm really curious to see what happens in the Orange Bowl with that game. But, that's great. The fact that you had that sequence of events occur and it highlighted just how empty the claims that the SEC was somehow superior to the Big Ten, so far superior that they deserved an extra team over an 11-1 Indiana team. But it can't just end with, hey, look at the results. This is something that has to be pressed consistently, because whether or not I think people want to admit it, there is a war going on for the soul, whatever, soul is probably the wrong word, but like the trajectory of college football, what gets preferred, how this plays out. The Big Ten is demonstrating that after really about a 15-year period of the SEC clearly having the most on-field talent, that's not there anymore. At least it's not that overwhelmingly there. The SEC was very average this year. And I would even resist the temptation of arguing that they were somehow top-heavy, because it's hard to take that Georgia team that seriously. You can argue like, well, they were missing Carson Beck in the game. I mean, Georgia hasn't looked that impressive all year. I keep going back, like you look through what they did this year, and it's just not. I mean, they beat Kentucky on the road by 1. They lose at Alabama, who ended up not being that good. They had a nice win on the road at Texas by 15. And then they, the rest of their games, like, okay, great, you won by 14 at home against Tennessee. That doesn't look that good now. You barely beat Georgia Tech at home. That doesn't look that great. Who are the rest of their wins against? Clemson, who started off poor and got better. Tennessee Tech, Auburn, Mississippi State, Florida, Ole Miss. They lose that game to Ole Miss. They don't even win. Ole Miss, doesn't even make the playoff because they can't get it done against Florida at the end of the year. My point being, like, this entire narrative about Georgia, about the top part of the SEC, it just wasn't accurate this year. But the arguments that get made over and over again that somehow the SEC exists on this different plane, I think those do matter. And what concerns me about what we saw over the course of the last 2 months in terms of the way the narrative was distributed and the fact that it seeped into play-by-play calls, the fact that it wasn't just isolated to Feinbaum's radio show, but it was like the main stuff in terms of ESPN's college football coverage, it was so insanely one-sided and so insanely SEC-centric that if you're the Big Ten, if you're the individual schools, if you're the commissioner of the Big Ten, if you're Fox, you almost have to organize a counter narrative and press that consistently, because otherwise, whether or not you think it matters, these narratives do set in and it changes the way that people think about the very basics of college football. And to me, that's what was happening throughout most of this last couple of months. That was the frame that was being set by ESPN on behalf of the SEC, their business partners. And I think it's damaging to college football. And I certainly think it's something that the Big Ten has to take seriously moving forward, because they were not participating in that and doing that same kind of thing. They were lucky that they had the allies in the college football commentary landscape that they did. Unlikely allies. Like, I never thought Joel Klatt would be someone that'd be speaking truth to power, so to speak, on behalf of the Big Ten, on behalf of teams like Indiana, Nicole Auerbach, Danny Cannell, like people like that. So I'm just saying this needs to be taken more seriously. I also think there just needs to be a more concerted effort by media entities in general to explain that this stuff does not always work in a cut and dried way. We heard so much crap about strength of schedule this year, for instance. Do you know what Indiana finished in strength of schedule? I bet you couldn't guess in a million years if you were asked to guess, like, what was Indiana's strength of schedule at the end of the year. All that we heard was like, oh, Indiana has the 100th ranked strength of schedule. Indiana, didn't play anybody. If you go look at the final strength of schedule numbers for this Indiana team, they finished 35th in strength of schedule. They finished 35th. You know who finished 37th in strength of schedule? Ole Miss. Iowa State finished below Indiana in strength of schedule. BYU finished below Indiana in strength of schedule. Miami finished 17 spots below Indiana in strength of schedule. That same Miami team that people were saying should have been in place of Indiana. These are partial metrics. They're opaque metrics. Like when ESPN talks about strength of schedule, you know what they don't do? They don't give you the formula that they're using to calculate strength of schedule. You also have something called strength of record, which we've talked about before, which takes the schedule that you played and it says an average top 25 team, whatever that means. We don't know that either because that's also opaque. Here's how well your performance against your schedule ranks in the entirety of college football. What did Indiana finish in terms of SOR, strength of record? They finished 8th, which is about where I said they were in the big scheme of things. They were the 8th best team in the country. You know who had the 7th best strength of schedule, but the 116th ranked strength of record in the conference or in the country was this year? It was Purdue. So, like, there are clearly teams that played really tough schedules and had a high strength of record. And this is where I'll give Georgia credit. They were first in strength of schedule and second in strength of record. But how is strength of schedule calculated is something that we really need to know. Ohio State was 8th in strength of schedule and 4th in strength of record. Texas was 11th and 5th. Penn State was 17th and 6th. Oregon was 21st in strength of schedule and 1st in strength of record. Notre Dame was 31st in strength of schedule, very close to Indiana, and 3rd in strength of record. All those teams belonged. All those teams belonged. And Indiana belonged as well. And this is where, ultimately we've got to start thinking about actually explaining these metrics and how they work and how they're being used. Like what ESPN presents as strength of schedule is actually different from how the committee does strength of schedule. There's this wild explanation that I was reading about the way the committee does things. I'm going to just read a passage here. This was something that was written by one of the commentators on the college football subreddit, which I highly recommend reading. It's actually one of the few sane college football communities that I've found, and one of the few sane subreddits that I've found. But this talking about strength of schedule, it should be noted that the CFP playoff committee does use strength of schedule as a way to determine its ranking, but that appears to be a different, also completely proprietary, which means private measure, which is different from ESPN and not public. There was an ESPN article on the playoff committee, and here's what it said. Strength of schedule is one of the most frequently mentioned metrics used to explain the Tuesday night rankings, which begin November 1st, but it's also one of the most subjective and debatable. There are fans who crave more, wanting the committee's strength of schedule formula spelled out in detail, but it's impossible because the interpretation of it is left to each individual committee member, and each typically uses about 4 to 5 variations on it. Now, that sounds bad, but it's actually not a bad thing because, again, strength of schedule in a sport where you have 130 teams at the top division, you have 12 regular season games, you don't even play all the teams in your own league. If you're the SEC, you load up generally with a bunch of group of 5 and FCS teams in your non-conference. There's no real way of effectively metricizing what everybody's strength of schedule is. Why that was used as a primary tool to try to bludgeon people over the head about why Indiana or SMU didn't belong, especially when they hadn't played their whole seasons, to me is illustrative of the larger issue, which is that ESPN, and I'll pick on them specifically here, had a specific agenda, which was pro-SEC, that they decided to push at the expense of almost everything else. And it paints a false picture about how the process works, about what actually is being factored in. It becomes less about what the committee's doing and how the committee's evaluating things, and it becomes a lot more about what the commentators think it should be. And that's not what this is supposed to be all about. And I'm curious to see how that ends up changing moving forward, or if it changes at all. Because I think the idea that ESPN is suddenly going to stop acting that way is fanciful. I think that they're going to keep doing this. They're probably going to double down on it moving forward. And that's why I think you just got to stay vigilant, stay active. Whether you are an influencer or whether you are just a fan online, there's plenty of evidence out there that illustrates that everything we heard about Indiana and a lot of what we heard about the Big Ten was just crap. Indiana did belong in the playoff. Indiana did everything that they were supposed to do. All the metrics that should be used in their completion indicated that Indiana was one of the top 10 teams in the country. They didn't have a great game against Notre Dame. Guess what? Neither did Georgia, the team that was ranked number 1 by ESPN's own rankings. On a neutral field, I'll note, not in the cold that we saw in South Bend when Indiana played them. So, just some things to keep in mind, some things that I was thinking about over the course of these last couple of weeks. I'll also note, the idea that strength of schedule is some kind of end-all be-all about the relative strength of teams was always silly. Notre Dame's strength of schedule going into that game was 44th. Georgia's was 1st. What happened in the game? Georgia should have won handily. They didn't. So that's going to be an interesting thing to keep an eye on as we move forward. And I think there's just a lot of comments and a lot of discussion still to be had about the outcome of the season. It's going to be really interesting to see, how these semifinal games end up playing out. It's been a fascinating experiment, and I think it actually bodes well. And one last thing I'll say, one of the things that people have tried to argue with this college football playoff is well, gosh, look, all the underdogs lost in the first round, and now all the bye teams lost in the second round. That just means that there's too many teams in the college football playoff. And the one thing I'll say, and I noted this on Twitter, you have to remember that a lot of the talent disbursement that's happened in college football over the course of the last 20 years, where does the talent accumulate? It's generally accumulated at the 5 or 6 schools that could make a 4-team playoff. And again, you're talking about the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Clemsons, the there's several other schools, like 3 or 4 other schools that fit in that category. Ohio State is certainly in the mix there. It's a 12-team playoff now, which means 12 teams have a chance to make it to a college football playoff final. And what you've seen this time around is that you don't necessarily lose a lot by not getting a bye, which actually makes it more attractive to go to a larger number of schools if you're a player of a certain caliber who wants to play for a team that could play in the college football playoff. So this first year, I think, is interesting because you still have this separation between the very top teams from a talent perspective and the rest of the teams. But I think what you're going to see is more and more players looking at a broader array of potential schools, including Indiana, and saying, I can go there and win a title, or I can go there and compete for a title, or at least get in the playoff. That's going to help college football in general. The clustering of the very best talent amongst the very smallest number of schools, I don't think is particularly good for the sport. And as popular as college football is right now, I think it has the ability to be even more popular because it is a sport that has both a national pull, but also has a local or regional pull based on those schools and their fan bases and people getting really invested. We saw it in Indiana this year, like a program that would struggle to get 35, 40,000 people like really engaged and excited about their football program, sold out their last 4 games and created an atmosphere that was so overwhelming that Curt Cignetti, who really could have gone anywhere he wanted to if he wanted to bounce, was like, no, I want to stay here. Something really special happened. That same thing can happen in other places. Look at the excitement at a place like Illinois, who a couple of results go differently for them earlier in the year. Maybe they're a contender for the college football playoff. There's so many places that just have had a hard cap on what they could do. This particular college football playoff format opens that up for a lot of different programs and a lot of different fan bases. And I think that's fundamentally a good thing. It's also something that a lot of people out there don't want to see. They want to see the clustering. They want to see a very small number of teams and schools having a chance at that, and they want everybody else kind of relegated to the side. So it's going to be interesting to see how all of it plays out. Ultimately, I think the biases that we saw and a lot of the framing that we saw and the way that a lot of this was presented over the course of the last 2 months was really disappointing. But it's good because people have transparently opened up their agendas. So you don't have to be surprised moving forward. And you know what you need to do and what you need to say to try to combat that. And I think that that's important. So anyway, that's going to wrap up part 1. And we'll be back with part 2, talking about IU basketball in just a little bit. My thanks, as always, to you folks for listening and watching and whatnot. And my thanks to Home Field Apparel, our presenting sponsor. We'll be back with more Crimson Cast here shortly. Be sure to tune into part 2. I am Galen Clavio. We will catch you folks on the flip side. Happy New Year. Happy 2025. Once again, folks, stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.